I brought a special guest to do the real intro. My mother is visiting from Tennessee.
My name is Pat, and I'm very honored and proud to be here with my daughter, Kristen. And you don't get to see as a parent your child at work very often, and I'm very honored to be here. But I knew Kristen was going to really do fine things in her life when at 4 she got a hula hoop, and she practiced, and she beat out all of the 10-year-olds at a contest. And I'm very proud of her.
Thank you. Parents are probably the ultimate product manager, so let's give it up if you're a parent in the room. Okay, thanks. Thanks, guys, for indulging that. So I'm going to start by sharing one of my favorite charts in social science. So there are 2 types of companies. Some companies have close to 50% of their employees saving for retirement, but some have over 90% of their employees saving for retirement. So what explains the difference between these 2 types of companies? Raise your hand if you think it's income separates these companies. Raise your hand if you think it's education. Few. Raise your hand if you think it's age, different age of employees. Got it. Turns out it actually has nothing to do with the usual suspects. So let me explain Carla. Carla makes around $30,000 a year. She has an 8-year-old son. Things are tight, but Carla is saving for retirement. Carla is on the right. So the secret for these employees and the secret for Carla is the form that they fill out when they first get hired. For the people on the right, they are automatically enrolled in retirement savings. They don't do anything, and they start saving. And for the people on the left, they have to fill out a form. They also don't do anything, but they don't start saving. So my name is Kristen. I'm a behavioral scientist, and I study behavior change. And I've worked with companies in Silicon Valley to do behavior change for good. And so when you ask people, why are you saving for retirement, over 80% of people say, because I care about my future. I really want to travel in retirement. I don't want to be poor in retirement. That's why I'm saving for retirement. How many people say the default? So we asked around 1,000 people, and we coded the answers, and less than 5% said anything close to a new hire process, a default, or auto-enrollment. Said a different way, that means 95% of people have no idea why they do what they do. And so as a behavioral scientist, I study the gap between what people say they will do and what they actually do. So most organizations today start their product development process by asking people questions. Raise your hand if you do interviews, surveys, focus groups. So behavioral science, and I'm going to suggest that it's actually just not working. So financial providers should be basically helping us spend less, but our bank accounts aren't growing. Healthcare providers should be helping us eat less, but our waistlines are definitely growing. And social media should help us connect, but we are lonelier than ever. So today I'm going to give you a sneak peek into my work, and we're going to talk about why we study what people do versus what they say, and how to build products that make people happier, healthier, and wealthier. And to do that, we're going to look at the 3 types of questions that organizations ask. They ask you about the past, what have you done? They ask you about the future, what will you do? And they ask you why you've done something. So first, the past. So imagine you work at a hospital and you want to prevent the unnecessary spread of infection. So increasing hand washing is a proven way to do this. So if you're at the organization, you'd likely want to know how many times people wash their hands. So let's try this. So how many of you forgot to wash your hands the last time you went to the bathroom? You can raise your hands, just don't hit your neighbor's face. We put cameras in the bathroom to figure out who could be lying. Just kidding. But so it's easy to see that you may lie when asked this question in public, but even in a private survey, people say that they forget to wash their hands less than 1 of 100 times that they go to the toilet. So when you're asking people questions about the past behavior, we tend to underreport answers for two reasons. The first, it's just not socially desirable to tell the truth. So do you text and drive? No. Do you eat chocolate in the morning before work? Never. Never done that. Do you forget to wash your hands? Of course not. So we cannot actually fix hand washing if we rely on these answers. And the second issue with asking about the past is that we just forget, right? You've probably gone to the bathroom 2,500 times in the last year. I'm going to ask you about your 2,471st. You're just not going to remember. And so we cannot report accurately if we do not remember. So that's the past. Now let's talk about the future, questions that ask, what will you do? So imagine that you're a healthcare organization now and you're looking to help people with hypertension. That's high blood pressure. So if people forget to take their medication or adhere even a little bit inappropriately, they have 3 times higher likelihood of dying of a stroke. And so as a healthcare organization, you'd likely want to ask people if they need help to remember to take their medication. And so we did this. We asked people, how much help do you need to take your life-saving medication? And 58% have said, we're good. We don't need any help. Right? It's important for my health. Of course, I will take my medication. And the sad and alarming fact is that hypertension adherence is shockingly low. 50% of people stop taking it entirely within the first year. So how could people get this so wrong? They say that they don't need any help, but clearly they do. So when you're asking people this type of question, they're actually imagining their ideal self. In the future, you're a perfect person. Of course, you're going to take your medication, right? You forget that in the present moment, life is happening. You have to pick your kid up from daycare. There's a work-fire drill going on, right? People cannot predict the future if you don't understand the exact environment and understand how you will react when put in that. Let's take another example. So there's a large company in Los Angeles that wanted to increase the healthy eating that their employees did during lunch. And so they looked at studies. Turns out that people like apples. They said, people like apples, let's put out free apples in our cafeteria. Is that funny? You don't like apples? Let's put out free apples in our cafeteria. And so they did this, and then they call us up and said, you know what? Nobody is taking the apples. What's going on? And so we said, OK, let's actually observe the cafeteria. And so we stood there for 2 hours and watched as people passed by these apples. Sure enough, no one was taking the apples, but with one look at the cafeteria, we figured out what was going on. The apples were competing with the fries. When companies ask people questions, they assume that the answers are strong preferences. Sure, people say that they like apples, but when faced with the apples or the fries, they're going to take the fries. Interview questions are asked in a vacuum, as if people can predict their exact environment that they're in. And so we cannot rely on people to predict their future behavior if they cannot replicate the exact environment that they're in. OK, so we've just done the past. So we can't trust the past for a couple reasons. The future, we think about our ideal self versus our actual self. Now let's talk about why questions. Why did you do something? These actually tend to be the most misleading questions there are. This is the Carla, why are you saving for retirement question, right? She says it's because I care about my future, but what we actually know is there's something else going on. In this case, it was the form. Why does that happen? So it's because when you're answering questions, you think about yourself, and we see ourselves as these highly rational people, and this is how we answer the question, right? I thought about it deeply, I considered all the options, and then I picked the best one for me. It's not, I was just too lazy to uncheck a box. Or I just did what everybody else was doing. Or I actually have no idea. You never hear people say this in an interview, and yet these answers are closer to the truth. So if you can't trust what people say, then this is actually a very depressing talk. What do you do? So as behavioral scientists, we have a process called behavioral design, which basically uses behavioral science to inform design decisions. So we move away from asking people about the past, the future, and the why, and we use actual research to inform our design decisions. So I'm going to give you an example of what this looks like. Actually, first I'll give you the 3 steps. So we do a behavioral diagnosis. So behavioral diagnosis is a map of every single step somebody takes in order to get to an outcome. And then we outline the psychological biases that affect their decision making. So it could be optimism bias, information aversion, present bias. And then we do an experiment to figure out what people do versus what they say. So let's talk about an example. So student loan debt is crushing US college kids. However, there is sorry about my slides, they're a little misaligned there. There are 2 million students who actually are eligible for free financial aid that do not take free financial aid. So they're not taking it, and when you ask them why they're not taking it, they say because they don't have information about eligibility, if they're eligible for the financial aid. So Harvard researchers actually did an experiment, and they looked at if you give people information about financial aid eligibility, do they actually apply more? And the answer is no. So this is a place where basically listening to people will actually surely lead you astray. So we worked with a company called AdmitHub and West Texas University to figure out how you actually get more people to apply. So we did behavioral design. First, we did a map. We did a behavioral diagnosis, and we laid out every single step that it takes in order to get to apply for financial aid. There were over 20 steps, and on average, it took someone 55 minutes, and that's on a good day. Right? And then we laid over the psychological biases that were most at play when making this decision. And it turned out actually the decision to apply or not apply at the very beginning was causing people this cognitive overload. And then they'd push off the decision until later. This is called procrastination. Later came and it was too late and they missed the deadline. And then we did an experiment. And we had 2 conditions. And one condition was just reminding people that they could apply. And in the other condition, we tried to remove the cognitive overload. And what we did is text people something that said, hey, filling out the financial aid is now just a part of the enrollment process. So we didn't actually force people to apply, but we removed the decision deadlock and basically made it easier in the path of least resistance to apply. And by doing this, we actually increased, or the odds of applying were triple for people who did not apply the prior year. And when scaled out to the US, this is 230,000 more applications and people who may not have student debt. A very simple process of basically just mapping what's going on in the system in a very detailed level, identifying the psychological biases at play, and then doing an experiment to figure out what people do and not what they say. Because if we trust what they say, we'll definitely be misled. And I think here is where we kind of step back and say, actually, the stakes are pretty high, right? People actually want to take their medication. Your customers, if you're in healthcare, want to be healthy. There's nobody who would raise their hand and says, you know, I'm just not ready to be thin. That's just not me. Or raise their hand and say, you know, I just don't want to have money in old age. People want to do these things, and yet we're not. And the behavioral science hypothesis is because we're actually being misled. We're listening more to what people say and not what they do. And we want to flip that paradigm and listen to what people do and not what they say. So in behavioral science, this is called behavioral design, and we use it to basically make people happier, healthier, and wealthier. Thank you.